Ever wonder what happens when, like the cutting edge of brain science meets those like age-old philosophical questions?
Yeah, it's a fascinating intersection, isn't it?
You've shared some pretty interesting thoughts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on neuroethics.
Yeah.
And so we're going to dive deep into that, specifically for someone, with a philosophical mindset.
It's a rich area, especially for philosophers, because it really challenges some of our fundamental concepts about, the mind, morality, the self, all these things we've been thinking about for centuries, but now with this new lens of neuroscience.
Yeah, and we'll be focusing on the neuroethics entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So, pretty rigorous and authoritative source.
Definitely. It provides a great foundation for understanding the key concepts and debates in the field.
All right, so let's, what's our mission for today's deep dive? What are we trying to get out of this exploration?
Well, I think our main goal is to, first of all, really grasp the core concepts of neuroethics, what it is, how it's defined, and what makes it distinct from, say, traditional bioethics.
Okay, so like what makes it unique?
Right, exactly. And then we'll delve into the key debates within neuroethics, those areas where there's disagreement or uncertainty about the ethical implications of certain neuroscientific advancements. And finally, we'll really try to understand how this all connects back to those big philosophical questions you mentioned about the mind, the self, ethics, and how these concepts are being reshaped by our growing knowledge of the brain.
Okay, I like it. Sounds like a plan.
So a good place to start, I think, is with Adina Roski's distinction between the two main branches of neuroethics, the ethics of neuroscience and the neuroscience of ethics.
Okay, I remember reading about that.
So the first branch, the ethics of neuroscience, is really concerned with the ethical issues that arise from our ability to treat, enhance, invade, and even manipulate the human brain. Things like brain imaging, brain stimulation, cognitive enhancement, all those sorts of things.
So like the ethics of actually messing with the brain, so to speak.
Precisely. And then there's the second branch, the neuroscience of ethics, which is more about trying to understand the biological basis of our ethical thought and behavior. So, what's going on in the brain when we make moral judgments, feel empathy, act altruistically, those sorts of questions.
Okay, so one branch is more about the ethics of doing things to the brain, and the other is about understanding the brain basis of ethics itself.
Exactly. And this distinction is really important because it highlights how neuroethics goes beyond the traditional scope of bioethics, which tends to focus more on issues related to bodily health and medical treatment. Neuroethics, particularly with this neuroscience of ethics component, is really pushing us to consider the material basis of our moral selves and our ethical decision-making.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. If we're talking about the ethics of manipulating the brain, we really need to understand how the brain actually works, how it creates our sense of self, our values, our morality.
Absolutely. But this broadening of scope wasn't without its initial controversy. In the early days of neuroethics, there were some philosophers and ethicists who questioned whether the neuroscience of ethics truly belonged under the umbrella of neuroethics. They argued that it was more of a purely scientific endeavor, just trying to understand how the brain works, and not really an ethical issue in and of itself.
So like separating the science from the ethical implications.
Right. And there were also questions about whether neuroethics was really distinct enough from traditional bioethics to warrant its own separate disciplinary status.
Yeah, is this a unique field or just an extension of bioethics?
Exactly. But the counter-argument, which I think has become pretty well established now, is that this interdisciplinary approach, bringing together neuroscience and ethics, is absolutely crucial for addressing the complex ethical challenges raised by these new technologies.
Right, you can't really have one without the other if you want to make responsible decisions.
Right. I mean, how can we ethically evaluate interventions that affect the brain if we don't understand how the brain itself works, how it shapes our thoughts, our feelings, our very sense of who we are?
Makes total sense to me.
And Martha Farah, who's a leading figure in neuroethics, she put it really eloquently when she said, "New ethical issues are arising as neuroscience gives us unprecedented ways to understand the human mind and to predict, influence, and even control it. These issues lead us beyond the boundaries of bioethics into the philosophy of mind, psychology, theology, law, and neuroscience itself. It is this larger set of issues that has earned it a name of its own."
Yeah, that really captures the essence of it, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights the unique and expansive nature of neuroethics. And I think it's worth noting that this field has really matured over the past couple of decades. We now have dedicated research programs, academic journals, professional organizations, all focused on exploring these complex ethical issues. So it's definitely a field that's here to stay.
Right, and growing rapidly, I imagine.
Absolutely. So I guess to dive into the specifics, shall we start with the ethics of neuroscience and those, technological advancements that are raising all these ethical questions?
Sounds good to me. What are some of the big things that come up there?
Well, one of the key points the source emphasizes is that this branch of neuroethics is really driven by two main things. First, the rapid advancements in neurotechnologies, and second, our growing understanding of the brain's pivotal role in shaping both our individual identities and our social structures.
Okay, so it's like the technology is advancing so fast and we're learning so much more about the brain, and it's all happening at the same time, creating this sort of ethical whirlwind.
Exactly. And a big part of the challenge is the inherent uncertainty that often accompanies these new technologies. We're constantly discovering new things about what they can do, their potential benefits, but also their potential risks and limitations.
So we're kind of figuring it out as we go along, which
Yeah.
makes the ethical side even more complex.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're developing these incredibly powerful tools that can directly impact the brain, which is, the organ that essentially defines who we are, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, our personalities. So the stakes are really high.
Right? It's not like we're just talking about some new gadget or app here.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
stuff that goes to the core of what it means to be human.
Precisely. And one of the most prominent and hotly debated areas within the ethics of neuroscience is the issue of neuroenhancement.
Yeah, that's the one that always gets people talking, right? Like, should we be messing with our brains to make ourselves smarter, happier, more productive?
Exactly. And the term cognitive enhancement is used to refer to those technologies or interventions that are specifically designed to improve normal cognitive function. So things like, medications that enhance focus or memory, brain stimulation techniques that boost cognitive performance, even things like brain-computer interfaces that might augment our cognitive abilities in the future.
Okay, so it's not just about treating diseases or disorders, but actually going beyond normal functioning to enhance our abilities.
Right. And this immediately raises all sorts of philosophical questions, doesn't it? Like, what do we mean by normal in the first place? Is there something inherently wrong or unethical about trying to improve our cognitive abilities beyond what we're naturally capable of? And what are the potential implications for society if these enhancements become widely available?
Yeah, it really gets into some fundamental questions about human nature and what it means to live a good life.
Absolutely. And the source mentions this common framing of the debate as being between transhumanists, who are generally in favor of using technology to enhance human capabilities, and bioconservatives, who tend to be more cautious or even opposed to such interventions. But I think the more interesting and productive philosophical conversations are happening in that nuanced middle ground where we're really trying to carefully weigh the potential benefits and risks of these technologies on a case-by-case basis.
So it's not just a black and white yes or no kind of issue. It's much more complex than that.
Right. And a key challenge here is that the distinction between therapy and enhancement can get really blurry, especially when we're talking about the brain. The source gives the example of methylphenidate, also known as Ritalin, which is commonly prescribed for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. But it's also sometimes used by people without ADHD as a study aid to improve focus and concentration. So is that therapy enhancement or something in between?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, if someone has a diagnosed condition that's interfering with their ability to function, then using medication to improve their focus seems like a clear case of therapy. But if someone's just using it to get ahead in school or at work, then it feels more like enhancement.
Right. And this raises the question of whether we should assign a fundamentally different ethical status to cognitive enhancement compared to physical enhancement. I mean, we readily accept, even admire the use of physical training and technology to enhance athletic performance. But when it comes to directly intervening in the brain, there seems to be a greater level of hesitation, a more intense ethical scrutiny.
I think it's because we tend to view our cognitive abilities as being more central to our identity, to who we are as individuals, than our physical attributes.
Yeah, that's a good point. We see our minds as the source of our thoughts, our beliefs, our values, our creativity. So messing with those seems to have a much greater potential to change who we are at our core.
And then you get into all sorts of issues about fairness and equality, right? Like if these cognitive enhancements become available, will everyone have equal access to them? Or will they just further exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities?
Absolutely. That's a huge concern. And there's also the potential for coercion, even if these enhancements aren't mandated by the government or anything like that. If you're in a highly competitive environment, like, say, academia or certain industries, you might feel pressured to use these enhancements just to keep up, even if you have personal reservations about doing so.
So you might feel like you have to enhance yourself just to stay in the game, so to speak.
Exactly. And that brings us to the concept of cognitive liberty, which the source defines as the fundamental freedom of thought, encompassing both the right to mental privacy and the right to mental autonomy. These are ideas that are deeply embedded in many philosophical and legal systems, but they're facing new challenges in the age of neurotechnology.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. What do we mean by mental privacy and mental autonomy in this context?
So, mental privacy refers to the idea that our thoughts, our beliefs, our inner mental experiences are our own, and that we have a right to keep them private unless we choose to share them with others. And this has traditionally been seen as a fairly straightforward concept. Our minds are essentially inaccessible to others unless we explicitly communicate our thoughts.
But neurotechnology is kind of changing that, isn't it? Like with brain imaging and all that, people are starting to get a glimpse into what's going on inside our heads, even if we don't want them to.
Right. And while we're not yet at the stage of perfect mind reading, where someone can just hook you up to a machine and know exactly what you're thinking, the technology is advancing rapidly, and it's raising some legitimate concerns about the future of mental privacy.
I remember reading about those fMRI studies where they could actually decode certain thoughts or images from people's brain activity, even if they weren't trying to communicate them. It's pretty wild.
It is, and I think it's important to understand that fMRI, which stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging, is one of the most powerful tools we have for studying the brain. But it's also often misrepresented in the media and popular culture as being far more sophisticated than it actually is.
Yeah, like it's some kind of magical mind-reading device.
Right. But the reality is that fMRI is an indirect measure of brain activity. It detects changes in blood flow that are correlated with neural activity, but this correlation isn't perfect, and there's a lot of noise in the data. And even with sophisticated computer algorithms, we can only decode very general types of information from brain activity. Things like whether someone is looking at a face or a house, or whether they're thinking about a particular category of objects.
So we're not talking about reading people's minds like a book or anything like that.
No, not at all. But even with these limitations, there are still real and legitimate concerns about the potential for neurotechnology to erode mental privacy. For example, there's the possibility of identifying individuals based on their unique brain activity patterns, kind of like a neural fingerprint.
Yeah, that's kind of creepy.
It is. And there's also the potential for inferring unwanted or unknown attributes from brain data, things like implicit biases or predispositions to certain behaviors.
So even if they can't read our minds directly, they might be able to glean information from our brain activity that we didn't intend to reveal.
Exactly. And this raises all sorts of ethical questions about consent, privacy, and the potential for discrimination. Like, what if employers started using brain scans to screen job applicants for certain personality traits or predispositions? Or what if insurance companies used brain data to assess risk and set premiums?
It sounds like a slippery slope.
It does, and it really highlights the need for careful ethical guidelines and regulations to ensure that these technologies are used responsibly and that people's rights are protected.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole issue of mental autonomy, right? Like the right to control our own thoughts and behaviors, to make our own decisions without undue influence or coercion.
Exactly. And there are several ways in which neurotechnology could potentially impact mental autonomy, both directly and indirectly. On the direct side, you have things like brain stimulation techniques such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, and deep brain stimulation, or DBS, which are already being used to treat a variety of neurological and psychiatric conditions.
Right, like Parkinson's disease, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And while these techniques are generally considered to be safe and effective when used appropriately, they do raise some ethical concerns about the potential for unintended side effects, especially if they're used to modify mood, personality, or behavior in healthy individuals.
Yeah, I remember reading about some DBS patients who experienced significant personality changes after having the implants. Like one guy became obsessed with gambling and another became hypersexual.
Right. And while these are relatively rare occurrences, they do highlight the potential for brain stimulation to alter aspects of our personality and behavior that we typically consider to be central to our sense of self.
And then you have the less direct forms of influence, like neuromarketing and neuroeconomics, which are using insights from neuroscience to try to understand how people make decisions and what motivates their choices.
Exactly. And this knowledge can then be used to develop more effective marketing strategies, advertising campaigns, or even political messaging. And the ethical concern here is that it could potentially be used to manipulate people's choices in ways that they're not even aware of, kind of like subliminal advertising on steroids.
Yeah, that's a bit unsettling.
It is. And then there's the whole issue of how neuroscience is impacting our beliefs about free will, which is a philosophical debate that's been going on for centuries. Some neuroscientists argue that our brains are essentially deterministic machines, and that our sense of free will is just an illusion.
So, like, our choices are predetermined by our brain activity, and we don't really have any control over them.
Right. And while this view is still debated within neuroscience and philosophy, it's starting to have an impact on how we think about responsibility, blame, and punishment. Like, if someone commits a crime but their brain made them do it, are they really responsible for their actions?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It is. And it raises all sorts of legal and ethical questions about how we should deal with criminal behavior in a world where we have a better understanding of the neurobiological factors that contribute to it.
It sounds like neuroethics is really forcing us to rethink some of our most fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human.
It is, and I think another area where it's having a profound impact is in our understanding of personal identity. The brain, after all, is the organ that essentially creates our sense of self, our memories, our personality, everything that makes us who we are. And as neurotechnology advances, we're developing new ways to manipulate the brain, which raises questions about whether these interventions could actually change who we are at a fundamental level.
Yeah, like if you could erase a traumatic memory or implant a new one, would you still be the same person?
Right. And there's also the potential for using brain stimulation or other techniques to modify personality traits or even to create entirely new ones. And this raises a whole host of ethical questions about authenticity, self-determination, and the nature of the self. Like, if someone undergoes a personality-altering brain intervention, are they still the same person? Or have they become someone new? And who gets to decide whether these interventions are ethically permissible?
It's like we're entering into some uncharted territory here, and we're not really sure what the rules are yet.
Exactly. And it's really important to have these conversations now before these technologies become even more powerful and widespread.
So let's talk a bit about some of the specific neurotechnologies that are raising these ethical concerns. The source mentions deep brain stimulation, or DBS, which is already being used to treat conditions like Parkinson's disease. But it can also have unintended side effects on personality and behavior.
Right. And what's particularly interesting about DBS from a philosophical perspective is that it seems to blur the lines between the brain and the self. Like, if stimulating a certain part of the brain can change someone's personality, does that mean that our personalities are just a product of brain activity?
It kind of challenges the idea that we have some kind of immaterial soul or mind that's separate from our physical brain, doesn't it?
It does, and it raises questions about whether we should be trying to control or modify our personalities through brain interventions, even if it's for therapeutic purposes.
Yeah, and it gets even more complicated when you consider the ethical implications of using DBS to treat psychiatric conditions like depression or obsessive-compulsive disorder. I mean, are we just treating the symptoms? Or are we actually changing who the person is at a fundamental level?
Right, and that raises questions about informed consent. Like, if someone agrees to undergo DBS for a psychiatric condition, do they fully understand the potential risks and benefits, including the possibility of personality changes? And even if they do understand, is it ethically permissible to change someone's personality, even if it's for their own good?
It's a really tricky issue.
It is. And then you have even more futuristic technologies like optogenetics, which allows for incredibly precise control of specific brain circuits using light, and CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology that could potentially be used to modify the genes that influence brain development and function.
Okay, I'm not even sure I understand how those work.
Well, the details are pretty complex, but basically optogenetics involves inserting genes into brain cells that make them sensitive to light, so you can activate or deactivate specific circuits by shining light on them. And CRISPR is a way of targeting and editing specific genes, so you could potentially use it to correct genetic defects that cause brain disorders or even to enhance certain cognitive abilities.
Wow, so we're talking about literally rewiring the brain and editing the genes that control it.
Exactly. And that's where the ethical questions get really mind-blowing. Like, if we can control the brain at that level of detail, what are the limits of what we should be doing? Should we be trying to enhance intelligence, creativity, empathy? And who gets to decide?
It's like opening up Pandora's box.
It is. And it's why neuroethics is so important. We need to start having these conversations now before these technologies become even more powerful and widespread.
All right, so we've talked about the ethics of neuroscience, which is all about the ethical challenges raised by new neurotechnologies and our growing understanding of the brain. But what about the other side of the coin, the neuroscience of ethics? What are some of the key insights that neuroscience is providing into the nature of morality?
Well, one of the most influential areas of research has been the study of moral decision-making using brain imaging techniques like fMRI. And one of the key findings has been that moral judgments seem to involve both emotional and cognitive processes.
So it's not just about cold, hard logic, but our feelings also play a role in our moral judgments.
Exactly. And this has led to the development of what's called the dual process model of moral judgment, which proposes that there are two main systems involved. One that's more intuitive, emotional, and automatic, and another that's more deliberative, cognitive, and controlled.
Okay, so sometimes we make moral judgments based on our gut feelings, and sometimes we think things through more carefully.
Right. And different moral dilemmas seem to activate these systems to different degrees. For example, when people are presented with the classic trolley problem, where they have to choose between sacrificing one person to save 5 others, they tend to show more activity in emotional brain areas if the action required to save the 5 people involves directly pushing someone in front of the trolley, as opposed to just flipping a switch.
Yeah, that makes sense. It feels a lot more emotionally charged to directly cause someone's death, even if it's to save more lives.
Exactly. And this suggests that our moral intuitions are often shaped by emotional factors, even when we think we're being perfectly rational.
So what are the implications of this for our philosophical understanding of morality?
Well, it challenges the traditional view that morality is primarily based on reason and logic. And it suggests that our moral intuitions may not be as reliable or objective as we might like to think.
So maybe our moral judgments are more subjective and culturally influenced than we previously believed.
Right. And this has led some philosophers and neuroscientists to question whether there are any universal moral principles or whether morality is ultimately just a matter of personal opinion or cultural norms.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. But I think it's an important one to consider, especially as we learn more about the neurobiological basis of morality.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the big questions that neuroethics is facing as we move forward?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is to figure out how to balance individual rights and freedoms with the potential benefits of neurotechnology. Like, how do we ensure that people have the right to mental privacy and autonomy while still allowing for the development and use of technologies that could improve health, well-being, and cognitive function?
Yeah, tough balancing act.
It is. And another challenge is to ensure that these technologies are developed and used in a way that's fair and equitable. We need to make sure that everyone has access to the benefits of neurotechnology and that these technologies aren't used to further exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to engage the public in these conversations. Neuroethics isn't just an academic exercise. It has real-world implications for all of us.
I completely agree. We need to have open and honest discussions about the potential benefits and risks of neurotechnology, and we need to involve a wide range of voices in these discussions, including scientists, ethicists, policymakers, and the general public.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into neuroethics. It's clear that this field is raising some of the most profound and challenging questions of our time.
It certainly is. And as our understanding of the brain and our ability to manipulate it continue to advance, these questions are only going to become more complex and urgent.
So for our listeners out there who are interested in exploring these issues further, where would you recommend they go to learn more?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great place to start, of course. And there are also a number of excellent books and articles on neuroethics that are written for a general audience. You can also find a lot of information online from organizations like the International Neuroethics Society and the Neuroethics Program at the University of Pennsylvania.
Great. Thanks for those suggestions, and thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
So, as a philosopher, you can see how deeply neuroethics engages with core concepts you've likely explored for years. But the empirical data from neuroscience adds new layers of complexity and demands a reevaluation of some long-held assumptions. Given the rapid pace of neurotechnological advancement, how might our understanding of fundamental philosophical concepts like free will or the self need to evolve in the coming decades to remain relevant and ethically sound? That's something to think about.
Absolutely. It's a really exciting and challenging time to be thinking about these issues.